Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast, where we sit down with top visionaries and creatives in the video game industry. Together, we'll unravel their journeys and learn more about the path they're forging ahead. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast. I'm Lizzie Mintus, founder and CEO of Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique video game recruitment firm. In every episode, we dive deep into conversations with creatives, founders, and executives about what it takes to be successful. You can expect to hear valuable lessons from their journey and to get a glimpse into the future of the video game industry. This episode is brought to you by Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm for the video game industry. We value quality over quantity, transparency, communication, and diversity. We partner with companies, creatives, and programmers to understand the why behind their needs and provide a white glove experience that ensures a win-win outcome. Before introducing our guest, I want to give Ed Freeze a shout out for introducing us. Today, we have Kelly Wallick on the show. Kelly has worked in the tech and video game industry for over 10 years. She's the founder of Indie MEGABOOTH, former chair of the Independent Games Festival, and a partner and community builder at the One Up Fund. She is a passionate believer in the strength and impact of community and implementing long-term change to support creative, unique, and diverse voices. Let's get started. Thanks for being here today, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yes, of course. First, I just want to ask you what inspired you to create the Indie MEGABOOTH 10 years ago, and how did you envision it when you started, and what did it become?
Yeah, there's kind of like a long, I don't want to say too complicated version of the story, but I'll give the short version. So I actually didn't start off in the games industry. I started as a chemist. So I went to school for sciences and I worked in that field for a handful of years before deciding to make the switch into the games industry. And so when I was first making that switch, I was working at a contract company that or contract shop that was doing, like contract work in enterprise software and in games industry work. And I started going to meetups. I was living in Boston at the time, and I started going to local meetups and meeting developers and getting to know the independent game scene, and just really fell in love with the people that are a part of it. It's, it's very entrepreneurial, it's very technical, it's creative. It's like, I don't know, I kind of felt like I had found my people. And so the first iteration in the Indie MEGABOOTH was kind of started in collaboration with a handful of other indie studios and some folks who had an idea around like helping to get more visibility at consumer-facing showcases. So when I initially started running it, it's a little bit more of a way to like get to know people in the games industry and to learn more and just kind of try something that I thought was going to be fun. And then it ended up getting really popular and taking off. So it kind of turned into this thing that became like more work than my day job, and then also something that I felt really passionate about and that I really loved. And so I ended up leaving that position and then running the MEGABOOTH as a full-time thing. So I think that like when I was first starting it, I didn't really have an idea or a vision of like what it was going to become. I was just kind of following this like organic thread of like all of these opportunities and things and people and ideas that seemed interesting to me. And I think even when I first started it, I didn't really think of myself as like a business owner or running a startup or that I had a company or anything like that. I was in my like late 20s at the time. And it just kind of seemed like, oh, I'm just doing this thing with some friends and like with these cool people. And, over the years that grew and changed and it became a lot more formalized. And I started hiring, employees and like having to manage all the stuff that goes along with running a business. And then, later on kind of accepted the fact that I was like running a company and had like created a business, as being a lot more intentional about like, what was it going to look like and what was it going to be? So, I think that it was kind of a combination of a lot of things and then just kind of, chasing a lot of opportunities that as things unfolded and just kind of seeing where it took me.
I love it. I think a lot of people have an idea of starting a business, but they really struggle with putting it into action. Can you break down kind of the first steps you took? Like you had this concept in your mind. What was even the first concept? And then how did you put on your first event?
Yeah, I've been talking with some folks about this a lot recently. I think I'm very much like an action person. I'll think about something for a pretty long time, but once I decide I'm going to do something, I'll just kind of like jump off the cliff and do it, and just sort of see what happens and try to trust that I'm going to be able to navigate it in the process. So I think that a couple of things is one, like when I was first starting I think I kind of benefited from not really understanding what I was getting into. And so there's a lot of learning along the ways. And I did have a job that I was working at and then kind of doing this as like a hobby or a side project for a little bit of time. So I'd say there was about like a year or year and a half where this was just something that I was kind of doing, in my spare time, a handful of months out of the year or something. And then as it began to grow and get more popular and the demands got bigger and bigger, then I was like, I started having folks approach me about wanting to sponsor it, and I was like, I literally don't even know how to take the money. Like, I don't know how I would like take the money from you. I don't really know what this would look like. And so a lot of the first steps, I think, were things that are really common to a lot of founders, is learning about like kind of how much paperwork and weird bureaucracy and little like things you need to do to actually get a company going. And I will give a shout out to like basically the entire games industry, as everybody was very kind and like super helpful and helping to answer questions and like guide me along the way. And this is like a lot of what we try to model and do for the One Up Fund community as well too. And what we were also doing with like the MEGABOOTH community is like, there's all of these things that go into like running and starting a business that kind of don't have anything to do with like what you think the idea of like your company is going to be or your product. But you still need to do them and they're still really important. But it's just piles and piles of like, the things that you don't know, and you just keep running into them over and over again. So, I mean, some of the very first stuff was just like, okay, how do I incorporate a company, or like, how do I, do that? And then like, do I want to be an LLC, or do I want to be an S Corp, or do I want to be a C Corp? And this is a US company. Things like, how do I open a business bank account, and like, how do I get an EIN number? I remember getting a business credit card felt really stressful because I didn't like really know which credit card I wanted to pick. And there's all these points and rewards and miles and, all of this kind of stuff. So, I think the initial bit was just a lot of this, like, what is all this like paperwork to do for me to like actually be able to get money into this and be able to run it as a business. I'm a big fan of like engaging with people who are like experts in what they do. So I always worked with an accountant. I always tried to work with like a bookkeeper. Like I really tried to get people in to be able, and lawyers to be able to like help me make the decisions that I needed to make for the long term, and to kind of like make sure that I was like protecting, myself and protecting the company and making smart decisions. And I think it's one of the areas that like I always kind of recommend people don't really cut corners on, because it can be a huge hassle and very expensive problem like later on. So, aside from all that, like the actual logistics of running an event too is just like, I'm thinking back to like, I didn't really understand how to get signage printed. I didn't know what the names of the signs were. So like somebody was like, oh, like those signs that they have outside of gas stations that look like sales, so I'm like Googling this stuff. I actually had my mom help me with like a handful of things, because I was like trying to get these signs printed and I need help with it. And we had a lot of like volunteers and people like pitching in to be able to like pick up the bits and pieces of stuff of like, okay, like we need to make a website and we need to like market this and we need to have social media accounts. And so it was really like especially at the start, it was very much like a kind of volunteer community driven effort. And then as it got to be what I was kind of feeling like too much work, basically, to have people just kind of like pitching in because it's like kind of fun, or, they can volunteer their time a bit. I really was like, okay, I need to like start having like people that are actually helping me do that. And around that same time is when I left and started doing it as a full-time thing. So around that time is when I started to be like, okay, I'm going to like see how much money do I have that I can kind of put into this in the start, like my savings and stuff. And like, how much can I afford to go? And like, how long can I try to do it? I had I think in my mind, about 6 months of being able to kind of give it a go. And if we weren't going to get money in, it wasn't going to work. And so, so just kind of when I look back at it, I feel like it's like terrifying, but I just kind of like went for it, found some people that would be able to help me more full time, and kind of try to make it a little more like professional, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah. I had the same thing with my business in starting it and having it, get bigger and then realizing that you have to put all these processes in place and think about be intentional. It's different when it's just you, and then you have to communicate it to other people.
Yeah. And even I think like, going from like one person to like 2 people to 3 people and then 6 people or something, like it starts to get like all these kind of weird communication challenges and stuff like pretty quickly, and I think there's something, we were never bigger than I'd say maybe 14 or 15 people at any given time, like maybe, a handful of full-time people and a handful of contractors. And then if you're counting kind of like, a lawyer, an accountant and bookkeeper and things like that. But we were working with hundreds and hundreds of studios. So we were kind of like scaling up and scaling down over and over again, which was kind of interesting. But now when we work with studios and, they talk about scaling up from like a handful of people to 15 or 20 people to 50 to hundreds of people, I think that those challenges are like, they're very interesting, and everybody's got kind of their own philosophies and opinions and thoughts about like, how do you resolve communication and how do you do team building and how do you build culture and all this stuff. And I just kind of find it like very endlessly fascinating because you're kind of creating your own, I don't know, like almost like family systems or little towns or community. It's I don't know. I think it's like kind of everybody does it in their own little way, right? And everyone has opinions on what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's really fascinating. And I found it like challenging to do that. Yeah.
And eventually it almost becomes an entity outside of you. Because at first it's really just you, and then it's its own separate functioning thing. And that's a really crazy point to get to.
Yeah. Like at some point we were hiring people that like I needed help with the curation work because we were looking at, I mean, probably 500-600 games a year or 700 games a year. And there was some point where I was playing literally every single game. I was having people help me with the decisions, but it got to a point where it was just like I needed help with doing the curation work. And so we started formalizing that and having more of a team of people and judges and stuff that we would pay in addition to industry people who would go in and do the judging and stuff with us as well. And people would like, I'd be sitting back and everyone would be having conversation about like, well, I don't think this is a Mega Booth game. And I think it's this. And it's like, it's clearly this and it's clearly that. And I was like, oh yeah, like this became so much of like a voice or like a distinct idea that like I could start to bring people in externally who like understood what the brand was or what the curation values were. And it was like very interesting to see something that like had been just kind of in my head or just something that like I didn't even really fully comprehend like what I was creating at the time, be able to be seen and understood by people who could just come in now and like and have those values like kind of on display already was like really interesting. It was a cool turning point.
Yeah, it definitely is an interesting business point. What are some of the biggest wins? Were there any games that were discovered or any, I'm sure there were so many, but any people that found each other? What are the biggest highlights from?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I wish I kind of had like a whole like list in front. I mean, we had a ton of games that came through, like one in particular that I think like Crypt of the Necrodancer was something that showed with us for the very first time. Right when they were very first getting started out, and recently when I was downloading Tears of the Kingdom, like they have a Crypt of the Necrodancer, like Zelda special edition, like basically being co-promoted with Tears of the Kingdom. And I was like, wow, that's really amazing. And so we've had, some experiences and teams like that. There's so many stories of just companies that like, I personally like love their game during the curation, and then I'd like to see them like kind of grow and launch multiple games and build communities. And so I'd say we have probably like, I don't know, like a handful or more of these kind of like big breakout hits that I would say like kind of made it off into the zeitgeist. But one of the things that I think is really like the most interesting is like hearing about how much that community like helped people or got them connected up with future co-founders or inspired them to get into games. And, it was interesting when we announced that we were going into hibernation at the beginning of the pandemic. I had like literally like 100 emails from just like different people and companies that were like sharing their stories of like what it meant to them and, the impact that it had on their career and the networks that they made and the people that they met. And it was really cool because like we, would work with folks and we'd stay in touch with them and we'd see them, but not everybody comes back and is like, hey, this is exactly what happened from when we were working together. And so even though it was like a very bittersweet situation, it was really validating and kind of heartwarming to hear, like, how much it helped to impact people's careers in just like a variety of ways that, I wouldn't have thought of or even understood. I mean, we worked with, I think it was over 800 studios during like the 10 years that it was running, and that's not to mention, all of the people who like came through the space or volunteered or, worked with us in some way or another. So, I think it had a pretty big impact on a lot of people.
And did you find Ed through this?
Kind of. So we got introduced by a mutual friend in the industry when he was first starting up the concept for the One Up Fund, because there's a really strong community component to it. This person was like, okay, you have to talk to Kelly. Like, if you're going to do a community thing, like, this is the person to talk to. So we got introduced that way, but I actually hadn't met him before or wasn't super familiar with his work. I mean, he's like clearly more on like a AAA side, and I was very on the indie side. And so like, I bump up against like, platform holders and publishers and big AAA stuff, but it's almost like I don't want to say like a separate part of the industry because there's a lot of intermixing between the two. Yeah, but we did get connected like through basically like my network and through his network that like overlapped somewhere.
Yeah, I imagine that he hired you for your community building. And
Yeah.
can you tell everyone when you started, kind of where the fund was, what your role was? And I've loved watching you grow and evolve. So now you're a partner. I want to hear more about that.
That's so crazy. Yeah, so we got connected up like 4.5 or 5 years ago. And like I said, I wasn't really super familiar with him, but he came with glowing recommendations from everyone that I had talked to that like knew anything about him. They're like, yeah, he's great, which it turns out he was. So they were correct in their assessments. And he really wanted to build this community with this kind of, he calls it like a venture fund wrapper around it. And so we had a phone call and we just really like gelled on what our vision was for the community and like for the industry overall, and how much we cared about developers and how much we care about diversity and founders, and like kind of basically just like using this experience as a way to like help make the industry better and to help to support the kinds of like games and founders and studios and stuff that we'd like to see succeed in the games industry. And so I was like, it sounded like we shared a lot of similar values. I liked his idea around it. I honestly at the time knew very little about venture funds, but I was like, okay, that sounds neat, and if I get to do the work that I think is really interesting, because also on top of it, the Megabooth was always bootstrapped and we never took external funding. It was always kind of running at like a break even thing, like kind of technically should have been, I think, run as a nonprofit when I look back at it. But the thing that was also really interesting with this is that it was an opportunity to have like an actual budget that would go towards this and kind of do like a, at the time, like kind of a smaller, more professional version of what I cared about and was doing with the Megabooth community. And for the Megabooth, there was a lot of focus, obviously, on like the in-person events and the curation and the kind of like promotional work and stuff. And the community stuff was like a component of that. But for the One Up Fund, it's like a set number of studios, and they range from indie to AAA, and there's kind of like a more I don't want to say professional in like a derogatory way, but like derogatory to like the indie scene, but more like kind of professional, like these are venture-backed studios that are like, running as startups and like want to grow. And I'd say like a lot of the indie teams that I remember working with through the Megabooth kind of, I think, ran the company similar to how I started the Megabooth, where they just like had an idea and just ran with it. And, you're kind of like learning along the way and you don't even really consider it a company. Like you're just considering it like the vehicle to like express the thing that you want to express. And so I thought it was like a really neat opportunity to like learn more about like that side of the industry, to learn more about like kind of the funding side, and also to have this opportunity to like really focus on like what makes the community component important and like how can we help to support that side of it, with a lot more focus than what I was doing with the Megabooth. So to me, it seemed like just kind of like, like kind of a cool, neat opportunity. And like, I was doing it part-time at first. And so to kind of supplement the work that I was doing with the Megabooth, and also as the chairperson for the Independent Games Festival for about like 7 years or so. So I was kind of piecemealing together a couple of these like projects and things to like help, like first off, like pay myself because and then second off to like kind of keep in touch with like a variety of different sides of the industry and to kind of like spread out like and give variety to the kind of work that I was doing.
And you started as a community builder, and then tell me about your transition to venture partner.
So Ed and I, were working together and building the One Up Fund in the community. And like, so I think he said it was like the first call or the second call that he made, like after, talking to the folks who put in the initial investment into the fund. And so I've been working on that part of it since like the very start. And then over the years, as I'm like running the community and building it and like learning more from the teams and talking to Ed and like kind of absorbing a lot about like, how does venture funding work in the games industry? Like, what does that look like? What are these terms? Like I'd heard some of it kind of thrown around, but for a long time, venture wasn't really in the games industry and all. And the amounts the deals that were getting done were like very large or, kind of in the spheres that weren't overlapping with like the indie scene. And in particular, I was doing a lot of work with like, kind of very like creative side of the industry as well too. So, there just wasn't a lot of interest from venture funds and like investing in that kind of stuff. So I was learning about all this on the way, enjoying my work with Ed, enjoying the work with the community. And then when the pandemic happened, like I mentioned, we had to put the mega booth into hibernation, which meant that like, it was unclear like what the future of this was going to be and what was going to happen. And, many like multiple years into everything, I was really thinking about like what did I want to do next in my career and like what was this going to look like for me, and like where did I want to focus on. And also, to be honest, like running the mega booth and doing that for like about a decade, it was hard. Like we never like kind of got to a point where it was like fully profitable. It was like self-sustaining, but it was like this kind of thing where it's like, okay, it's running and it's going, but it's like, do we grow it? Like do I hand it off? Like what's going, like I was already kind of having these like thoughts and conversations in my head. And then the pandemic, for better or for worse, gave me a good opportunity to like take a breather from that and rest and kind of like recover from burnout and like really like I said, like be intentional and think about like what I wanted to do next. I had started working when I was basically like 16 and had been like supporting myself ever since then. So this is like also one of the first times that I really had to like stop and like think about what I wanted to do next. And so around that same time, or after I kind of recovered a bit, we were finishing up the investing out of Fund One. VC stuff in games was really kind of like blowing up. There's a lot of interest in it. I was learning like a lot more about what was going on with other funds, and kind of keeping like a much closer eye on the VC and the funding side. And Ed was really looking, I think, to have someone to come on to like help support that growing and continuing on. And since we like working with each other, I joined as a partner. It's been about a year and a half, getting a little closer to like 2 years now, since I joined on that side of it. And it's been really fascinating. Like I've really enjoyed working with Ed. Like I think he's done a really great job of like kind of helping to like mentor me into the space and to like help to kind of like teach me things that I would like need to learn, but also letting me explore and like try things on my own. And it's been nice because like the mega booth, I was a solo founder, so a lot of that I was just like, I had advisors and friends and people that were helping me, but it was also doing something very unique in the industry. It's not like I was running a game studio and there's a bunch of other game studios I could talk to. I was like running something that basically nobody else was doing. So it was really hard to have peers in the space or to have somebody to kind of help like guide me in what I was doing. So I think that with the One Up Fund, that's been like really beneficial, is to have someone who's like kind of like mentoring me through the process. And so that's been really cool. And also like I just feel really strongly about the impact of like decision-making powers around funding and like who gets funding and why are people getting funding and what does that look like. And I mentioned Ed and I both care a lot about diversity in the game space. It's something that I personally care about a lot. And I just feel like it's kind of like a place to have a really strong impact in like advocacy work in a way that's kind of very roundabout. And there's not a ton of people that are like me or look like me in the games venture space or venture space in general. And so to like be in a situation where like I'm a partner, I have like decision-making power, like Ed and I are the two partners in the fund, and then we have a fund administrator. So, there's not investment committees or layers and stuff above the decision-making for us. It's like, it's really just the two of us that are making these decisions. And that's like a cool situation to be in, and like I think a pretty rare opportunity.
You're so inspiring. I love that. Congratulations.
I was just realizing I'm like, oh, I just talked a bunch. So
No, it's so interesting to hear. And I love your evolution. Tell me, I'm sure you've learned so much. What an amazing advisor to have. What would you say? I asked at this too. What would you say really makes you as sure as you can be that you want to fund a specific game studio?
Yeah, I mean, Ed and I are rarely in conflict, I think, on the things that we're looking at. I don't, I'm like, I wonder if he said the same thing. I should listen to his episode. But we're really founder focused, and there's things like him and I have both, between the two of us, looked at like thousands of game projects over the years, and seen many companies come and go and projects come and go. Um, and so, I think that there's the one component of it is like, is this project or this idea or this concept like interesting? But I think what we really like focus on a lot is like, who is the team? Like, are they going to be able to weather the kind of like changes and things that come along with like running a game studio, right? And running a project. How are they looking at the culture of their company? What is their experience in the industry, or what are their aspirations in the industry? And so I think that like we're really looking at that. And there's times that we get off calls and both of us like will be like, oh, that was amazing, like loved everything, like just the kind of energy and the idea of it. And sometimes we'll get off and be like, I don't know, or like I don't know, like a vibe check on like which, to put it a little inelegantly. Um, but I think that like those feelings come a lot from like combinations of experience and kind of an intuition that is coming from like a large history of looking at this stuff over time. And also, we always do get really inspired by like young people who are like coming in the industry with like a lot of energy and fresh ideas, and looking at things on like the way that they could be instead of the way that they are. And so we really try to have a good mix within the community too, of like a lot of different voices and perspectives. And so, yeah, I think like we generally both will like kind of know whether something's going to be a good fit or not. And because we don't act as a lead investor, which I don't have to get too far into like how VC funding works, we do follow on. And so a lead investor is the one who's really going to dig into like all of the financials and all of the like details, and like make sure that like all of the kind of like, T's are crossed and the I's are dotted and all that. And so we also get to like kind of benefit a little bit from being able to like have that work be done by the lead investor. And then we can take our decision like based then on our feelings on it and like our thoughts and perspective, and our own kind of like due diligence that we'll do with checking with folks in the community or people that we know in the industry, and researching it, and be able to kind of combine those things to be able to like make a decision on whether we want to go for something or not.
Similar to what Ed said.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean, everyone says go with your gut, which is, how do you know? But
I know
a long time of seeing many pitches, but also founders and seeing somebody that says something a little bit different than everybody else, like a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
Like you said. What do you think? You talked about there's always a struggle going from 1 to 2 and just expanding your team. There's so many communication issues, and everybody handles it a bit differently because everybody builds a different team and has a different culture. But what are some ways that you find very successful teams overlap in how they operate or their fundamentals?
Yeah, it's funny, like I kind of joke about this, is that I think like at some point, like how good you do as a founder or a CEO kind of depends on like how much therapy you've done. Like I think it's a little less about like a checklist of things, or oh, we have this exact process. I really think that there's a lot of, for me anyways, there's a lot of humbling experiences. There's a lot of internal growth. You bump up against a lot of like kind of complicated emotional things, I think, along the way. And the pressure can be very high. Like when I was first getting started on like running my own thing, at that point, I already worked at a handful of like startups. I'd worked at startups in the sciences. I had worked at like a small company in the games industry. I talked to a lot of people who did startups, and I was like, the second or third person at a handful of companies. And I would look at like the owner and be like, they're doing like 25 or 30% more work than like what I'm doing. Or, it would be a little like, 30% harder or something like that. And then I got in the position where I was the person who was the founder and who was running it. And I was like, this is like 200% harder than I thought it was going to be, because there's a lot of stuff that's kind of like hidden from you, not intentionally, but just that you're kind of shielded from as someone who's not a founder of a company. And a lot of those have to do with like the pressures of, decision making around like finances and hiring and interpersonal stuff and HR things and, all this stuff that is just really emotionally was unexpected to me, like the volume of the pressure, I think. And if you kind of take it a little bit of a layer deeper, when you're creating a company and you're creating culture or you're building a studio, like I think subconsciously rebuild like dynamics and things that are comfortable to you, right? So like if you have say like history of like childhood trauma or something like that, or you have a lot of like unresolved things, which I've like, struggled with that stuff myself. It's like you like can unintentionally recreate dynamics that are really familiar to you, which can be healthy or unhealthy, right? And so like you needing to kind of continually work through these things that might seem unexpected, I think actually has a lot to do with like, how do you handle communication? How do you handle decision making? How do you handle pay? How do you handle, like all like that kind of filters off into a lot of different things. And so I think that like the ones that companies and teams that I think I see be at least the most like, I want to say successful in a sense of like trying to create healthy work environments and cultures and stuff, like you have to have a lot of self-awareness. You have to be ready to have complicated conversations. I think transparency is really helpful. Like thinking about like how do the systems that you create are going to affect people, in the immediate, and how is it going to affect it in the long term, and are you willing to resolve like mistakes that you make, because you're going to make them, like nobody's doing it perfectly, and like what does that look like, and how do you try to like go through the process with like as much integrity as you can like possibly have. Because I think that from the flip side, when I've seen like really say toxic cultures or toxic companies, it's kind of this like cracks in the foundation that happen very early, and maybe they scale up super fast or things get really big, and it's like it's really really hard to go back and like try to paint over it and be like, oh, like now it's fine. And it's like you kind of grew it out of that core, right? And so I think it can be really complicated to like kind of to backtrack from that. Not that it's impossible, but like I said, I think that like it can be, I think having like as much self-awareness as you can kind of like muster and really trying to be like honest with yourself on where you're at as much as you can be, and with people on the team and stuff, I think seems to like help with creating a culture that I think folks can look back at and at least be proud of, even if they made mistakes or it didn't work out, to try to do that. With as much like kind of authenticity and like realness as you can. And there's definitely dysfunctional companies that become super successful, and there's very functional companies that become successful. So I don't totally want to tie it into like, is it going to make you financially successful or not? But I think that it's possible to do both. And I think it's better for the industry and better for people to like, for founders, if they can try and do it in a way that feels like healthy, for themselves and for the people that are going to work with them.
Yeah. Build an intentional culture from the start. I had just had Eve Crevochet from Take This on.
Yeah.
She's wonderful, but she talked about how what you're building inside of your company and your culture really translates into your game, which then translates into your community that you build within your game.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah. And like, one of the things, like say when we're looking at a pitch, like you can kind of tell when people are coming at the industry in a sort of mercenary way, and like I think that comes through in their games, like where they're like, oh, we identified this market and this idea, and this testing did well with this, so we're going to put these things together and we're going to make this thing. And those games like can be successful to varying degrees, but I think even as a player and someone who really loves playing games, like you can kind of tell like where there's like, was there like soul and love and like attention and all that like put into the game. Or was it just kind of mushed together, with a bunch of like random ideas or, and like, again, it's not the only thing that you need to be successful, but I think the games that are really like crafted in that kind of way, it also comes out in the product, and it comes out in like, the community of people who end up playing it. And, like that's as a founder or as an employee of a company, like that's going to be, you're spending 8 hours a day at this place,
maybe
like
more if you're in the game studio.
Yeah, depending on the situation. We have a lot of teams actually that are really working on like doing 4-day work weeks and like kind of like non-traditional structures and like really, I think especially if you've worked at a company where you've kind of been in crunch culture or you felt really pressured or that there weren't enough resources, like when you do your own thing, it's kind of like, I don't know, when you go off to school or something, you're like, I'm going to do it
Totally.
differently, right? Like,
Yeah.
you kind of
That's
rebel against your parents a little bit.
a great analogy. I'm going to eat sugar. I'm going to do
I
this, but good things too,
know.
maybe.
Yeah,
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 I
and you
like
learn
that.
along the way, but I think sometimes like, yeah, a lot of I think good can come out of those experiences in a way too of like, like what do you not want to do or what do you not want to model with that
Uh,
behavior, like with your behavior or with your company's culture. And so we see a lot of that with the teams that we talk to is like really thinking about like what does the future of this industry look like and what do studios look like and what does the culture look like?
That's inspiring.
Yeah.
Interesting. And how are the stats on the 4-day work week? That was a heated topic.
Um, I'd say every company that we talk to that in the community that has talked about doing it, they love it. They would never go back. Like I have a friend who's been running a game studio for a really long time, like as long as like the Mega Booth was around. And they said like there was challenges with it, especially around deadlines and things like that, but the benefits so much outweigh the downsides that they couldn't imagine ever going back. We've also had some teams talk about how they had been at places where there was a 4-day work week and then they removed the 4-day work week and everybody
Yeah.
hated it, So, I mean, it's definitely a very easy way to ruin morale. Yeah, but I think, so far, like, yeah, every team that we have has like talked about implementing a 4-day work week just loves it, and there's different structures around that how they do it. Some have like core hours, some have it, it has to be Monday through Thursday, some have it that it could be any one of certain kind of days. There's a lot of like kind of variety in how that works. But another thing to think about, like there is a lot of studies that were done, the 8-hour workday came from like I think manufacturing, right? I think with car manufacturing. So it was like how long an employee could physically work before their productivity dropped. And then we just carry that over into intellectual work and kind of like mental work, which isn't really the same thing. Like you can like mentally get tired after like I think the average is about like 6 hours or something before people actually start to drop in their productivity. There is one of the teams called it chasing the muse, which I think is really interesting because we're in a creative industry, right? So people get excited and they're following a thread and they're in a flow state. So like how do you kind of balance those things? But I think the reality is that like, doing a 5-day, 8-hour work week or something was like a thing that was kind of implemented for manufacturing and then implemented into like an office culture and doesn't really kind of fit, I think, in like a modern tech culture. And then also like games as a creative industry also. So it's like you can't really, I mean, you can, but it's hard to be like, okay, be creative from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and
Yeah.
never without these other things or without getting like the rest and the time that you need to like become inspired and to have like space to like refill your creative like cup or bucket or juices or whatever you want to call it. And like that creativity and energy coming from like time and space and unstructured time as opposed from like kind of like to imposed like rigid structures, or kind of like forcing people to sit down and do something within a certain time. It's kind of I think the games industry is in a lot of unique positions around that. And so I think that there's a lot of experimentation on like how do you do this? Because you're like combining tech work and you're combining creative work and your creative like and intellectual work and all this stuff. And it's like, how do you actually make that work for people? I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
It's been an interesting experiment too. I mean, everybody went remote. Some companies are doing return to office. Some companies
Yeah.
are doing some days in office and flex hours and 4-day
Yeah.
work week. So I feel like there are a lot of experiments and companies
Yeah.
that want to have their own way of doing things. They've come from a big company and they have
Yeah.
taken some things away and they want to
Yeah.
try things. So I think we'll see in the next few years, it seems like there will be so many games that come out from studios that have had
Yeah.
these non-traditional ways of working, and then
Yeah.
you'll kind of see if
Yeah.
it works or not.
Yeah, and I also think that like, one of the things that I also really well, personally, I've been working remote and working from home for like, I don't know, 10 plus ish years at this point or more. So I'm a big fan of it, but I also think that it like allows an increase in diversity of candidates and ideas and because if you have a life situation where like you can't afford to live in a super expensive coastal city, or like you have family that you need to take care of, or you have kids, or like there's an endless number of reasons why that kind of structure might not work for somebody. It also, lets you hire globally, which I think could be really helpful. It lets you hire people with accessibility issues, or maybe people who might not be able to travel or be able to go into an office. So I just think that it also like opens the pool of people and voices and stuff that you can have working at your company, which, to me, like the audience of people who play games is super diverse and global. And so like the people who are making them should look the same way, right?
In theory, yeah, it is getting better. And remote hiring is truly the best thing.
Yeah.
For adding diversity or adding people. I mean, if you start a Seattle studio, you do have the same people that have been in Seattle for a really long time and bopped around to different studios.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. So
it's
I'm a big
refreshing.
fan. Yeah.
Me too. And so you've seen what it takes to make a really successful indie game from Indie MEGABOOTH, and then what it takes to have a successful VC-backed company in games. What would you say that the similarities and differences are?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that there's a lot with kind of like thinking about what kind of company you want to be building and the culture, and like, being intentional about that part, which I think is really important. Um, I don't know. I think that like in kind of the indie space, it's not that people aren't commercially viable or aren't seeking to be commercially viable, but there's definitely a lot more of a kind of like, independent streak in it, right? And like and really having this like kind of strong creative desire to like get an idea out there, or to just like express yourself in some way. And so I think that there's that. And then when I was like getting approached by a lot of like publishers, or, some investment stuff, like even prior to doing stuff with the One Up Fund, where people wanted to identify indie studios that like wanted to become, bigger, or commercially, big commercial successes, or like wanted to eventually sell the company. And it seems like, in theory, I feel like there should be a lot of overlap, but there's kind of not. I think there's like a really unique situation of people who have the kind of like, I don't know if you want to call it the indie spirit, who also like strive to have like to make one of the pillars of what they're trying to do is that it's large scale, and that it's like commercially successful in whatever way that looks like. Um, Not to say that ambition isn't there on the indie side, but I think that it's kind of less of the point, and a little bit more the point is the process and the journey and getting the artistic vision out. Um, and so, I'd say that that's kind of like maybe one of the differing factors, is like even the type of company that would go after VC funding, I think is different than the type of company that like just starts off as an indie studio. But I think that the overlaps are still there, right? And like there's still plenty of indie games that intentionally or not became very commercially successful, right? And are very commercially viable. And so I think that I'm trying to like kind of put my finger on like maybe what some good like differences between the two would be, but I think it's a little bit of the kind of like attitude going into it on like what are you trying to get and create out of the situation.
Yeah. And one would have more pressure.
Yeah.
And one would not.
Yeah. I mean, kind of depending, right? I think it's like whether is it external pressure or internal pressure. There's definitely a lot of like creative indie studios that it's like it can be very high pressure. Or, take a really long time. Like I've seen a lot of games that take, 8, 9, 10 years or something, or they're working on it for like an incredible amount of time because they're doing it with much less resources over like a slower period of time. As opposed to having a lot of resources and maybe a slightly shorter period of time. And I think also maybe it's a little bit of a kind of like punkiness on like, I don't want someone telling me what to do.
Yeah.
But like I mentioned before, I feel really strongly about the impact of funding. And I do think, and like to go back to the kind of diversity side of it, is that I think that like if you can properly fund your studio and pay the people who are working on it and like have access to the financial resources that you need, that also lets you run a more diverse studio. Because really, like if you're kind of bootstrapping, or you don't have sufficient funding, or you don't have a publisher deal or something, like the money has to be coming from somewhere. So you're either having people who are independently wealthy, or people that like can afford to work on things where they're not getting paid, maybe enough to sustain a family or to take care of other people, aside from themselves and their lives. So Again, not a necessarily bad thing, but I think that the industry's kind of like grown and changed a lot in that sense, where indie used to mean like no money from anyone, like no one telling you what to do, you're eating ramen, you're working in your basement. I think to people being like, okay, like that works for some people, but like there's everybody else that like, we live in capitalism, so we still need to like be able to pay people, and compensate them to be able to get a good level of diversity in the people that are working on this stuff.
I hadn't thought about that aspect, but that makes a lot of sense. I have one final question. And before I ask it, I want to point people to the OneUp website at oneupfund.com. My last question is, you said that you kind of had this self-reflection journey of what you wanted to do. And it seems like your why, maybe from my viewpoint, is connecting people and building these communities through different platforms. Maybe I'm wrong, but what is your why and how did you go about discovering it?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about this question a lot because it's interesting because I never really thought of myself as a person who builds community or makes community or brings people together. But it's clearly something that I'm almost compulsively doing at this point and have been doing, to different levels of success, with inside of my career and outside of my work. And so I think that there is something that is really exciting to me about like facilitating people's creative visions and to helping them like kind of achieve what I think that their potential might be, or to give them like opportunity that maybe I feel like I didn't have or I couldn't have when I was younger. And so I think there's something in there for me about like how much access can we give people to the resources that they might need to like become successful and to express themselves and to like kind of pursue their dreams, right? Like regardless maybe of what their backgrounds might be, or what their history might be, or where they come from. So I think that there's something in there that's like really energizing for me. And again, like I'm really a big fan of like how do we make big long-term changes? And so a lot of my political activism, I would say, in a way, is kind of filtered through like what do I want to see in the future, and like what do I want to see in the world, and like how can I have that impact? And so, to go back to like the culture of companies and what they're trying to build, like, think about like hybrid work and remote work and 4-day work weeks and building inclusive cultures and creating art and experiences and games for people that like are coming from that place and those values, I think in the very long term is kind of like pushing forward like a vision of the way that I would like the world to be, or society to be. And so to be able to like facilitate that for people, and to provide the resources that they might need, whether that's like community or networking with people or just access to resources or access to money or something, to me is like really like a big driving factor for a lot of this for me. And I think that like it wasn't clear that that's what was going on to me for a long time, but I'd say like over time and like watching these things grow and watching the impact that it's had and that the games industry has had on the rest of the world, I think has really kind of like solidified that reasoning for me. Is that it's like, I don't know, I'm very patient in some ways, impatient in a lot of ways, but I'm very patient in like how do we make big long-term sustainable changes towards like a positive vision of the future, which I think is I don't know, something I'd like to see more of.
Yeah. So you take a large vantage point on what you want, big picture, and then figure out how you can get there.
Yeah.
I like it. That's always it's hard to figure out.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And it wasn't, like I said, something that I went into it really intentionally trying to do. I think it was something that seemed interesting with people that I thought were really cool and that like were doing things that were like exciting and new and different and creative to me. And then really like kind of like shaping that slowly over time, like, I think probably subconsciously at first and then more consciously and intentionally as I got a better handle on like, what exactly was I working towards and striving towards and what was like the driving factors of that. I started off, like, I'd say very kind of very punky and very anti like, counterculture. I just wanted like all the kind of like, weird, different people in the world to like be able to have a voice and to do something interesting and express themselves. And then just kind of like went from there.
You've made it. I'm excited,
We'll see.
Kelly.
Yeah.
No, I'm excited to see
Yeah.
what the future holds for you.
Yeah.
We've been talking to Kelly Wallick, founder of Indie MEGABOOTH and partner of One Up Fund. Kelly, where can people go to connect with you or learn more about you?
So I'm just Kelly Wallick basically on everything. So I'm all over different social media sites, but I'm probably, I'd say most active on Instagram. I updated my personal website recently, so you can find me there. But probably the easiest way is through the One Up Fund, or through LinkedIn or email.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. To catch all the latest from Here's Waldo, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. We'll see you next time.